Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A day of high expectations. The morning sun glimmered against the sleek, polished exteriors of luxury private jets lined up at Eastbridge Airfield. The air buzzed with the hum of engines and the quiet chatter of staff preparing for another day, catering to the elite. Zara Reynolds, an elegant black woman in her early 30s, pulled up in a chauffeur-driven car. She stepped out gracefully, her presence exuding an understated confidence that turned heads. Dressed in a simple yet stylish beige trench coat and tailored slacks, Zara moved with purpose. Her natural curls framed her face, and her calm demeanor hinted at a life lived with dignity and grace. Today was important, though few around her would know just how much. Zara was en route to Geneva for a crucial meeting, a humanitarian summit where her voice could bring about significant change. But this wasn't just about business, it was about representing her people and a legacy she cherished deeply. As she approached her private jet, she couldn't help but notice the airfield staff bustling around, many glancing at her with fleeting curiosity. She was used to the stares. Zara had grown accustomed to walking into spaces where her presence was unexpected, even unwelcome. It didn't faze her anymore, or so she told herself. But today was different. At the base of her jet steps stood two cabin crew members. One was a tall man with sharp features and a scrutinizing gaze. Beside him was a younger woman with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Their uniforms were immaculate, but their expressions betrayed something far less polished. Zara's stride didn't falter as she approached them. "Good morning," Zara greeted them warmly, her British accent crisp yet soft. The man looked her over quickly, his brows furrowing ever so slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone neutral, but with an edge of doubt. "Yes, I'm Zara Reynolds. This is my jet," she replied, motioning toward the aircraft with a confident smile. The woman's eyebrows shot up, and she exchanged a quick glance with her colleague. The man's posture stiffened, and his doubt turned into open skepticism. "Your jet," he repeated, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Zara felt a familiar twinge in her chest, but maintained her poise. "Yes. I believe everything should already be arranged for my flight to Geneva." The man didn't move. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this jet is reserved for private owners." "Perhaps you're mistaken?" Zara's calm exterior remained intact, but she could feel the air shift around her. The woman beside him smirked slightly, clearly assuming Zara was out of her depth. Zara reached into her designer handbag and retrieved a sleek leather folder containing all the necessary documents. "Here are the ownership papers, along with my itinerary," she said, handing it over with steady hands. The man hesitated before taking the papers. He flipped through them quickly, but seemed uninterested in what they actually said. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. He handed the folder back to Zara, without even acknowledging its contents. "Ma'am," he continued, "if this jet belongs to you, I'll need to verify that with our management." "Of course," Zara replied evenly. The younger woman stepped forward, her smile now replaced by a thinly veiled look of annoyance. "Do you have identification?" she asked, her tone teetering on condescension. Zara handed over her ID without hesitation, her gaze steady. The woman examined it, her frown deepening. "And how exactly did you afford a jet like this?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, as though trying to mask the insult but failing miserably. Zara blinked, her patience wavering but not breaking. "I'm sorry, but is that really relevant?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to command attention. The question seemed to catch the woman off guard, and for a moment she said nothing. The man, however, stepped in, his voice growing louder. "Look, ma'am, we deal with a lot of high-profile clients here, and you'll have to understand that your claim is unusual." Zara felt the familiar knot of frustration tightening in her chest. She had spent her entire life proving herself in spaces where she was underestimated, where her success was questioned simply because of who she was. Yet, even now, when she had more than earned her place in this world, these moments still found her. I understand, Zara said finally, her voice calm but firm. But if you don't mind, I would like to board my jet now. My assistant should be arriving shortly to handle any additional questions. The man opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could, a voice interrupted. Is there a problem here? All three turned to see a middle-aged man in a suit walking toward them. He exuded authority, his sharp eyes moving between Zara and the cabin crew. This woman is claiming that this jet belongs to her, the male crew member began, his tone defensive. It doesn't seem to add up, the younger woman added quickly. The man in the suit turned his attention to Zara, studying her for a moment. And you are? Zara Reynolds, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Owner of this jet and a client of this airfield. The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Ms. Reynolds, I apologize for any inconvenience. Allow me to verify everything immediately. Zara inclined her head, her calm exterior betraying none of the irritation bubbling underneath. As the man in the suit walked away, the cabin crew exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, their confidence seemed to waver. Zara stood quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She thought of all the times she had faced similar situations, all the times she had been underestimated, doubted, or dismissed. But she also thought of all the times she had risen above it, proving not just to others, but to herself that she was more than capable of holding her own. The sound of a car pulling up behind her broke her train of thought. Zara turned to see her assistant stepping out, her face a mix of confusion and concern. She carried a folder in one hand and a phone in the other, clearly ready to resolve whatever issue had arisen. Ms. Reynolds, the assistant began, hurrying toward her, I just heard about the delay. Is everything all right? Not quite, Zara replied, her voice calm but firm. The assistant's arrival seemed to shift the atmosphere. The cabin crew's confidence continued to erode as they realized this situation might not be as straightforward as they had assumed. And Zara, standing tall and unshaken, knew that the truth would soon come to light. The first confrontation. The airfield had grown quieter, the earlier hum of activity fading as Zara stood near her jet. Her assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Lila, was already flipping through the documents she had brought. Lila's professional demeanor contrasted starkly with the unease radiating from the two cabin crew members. The man's confidence had been replaced by a subtle defensiveness, but he wasn't ready to back down. Look, we're just doing our job here, he said, addressing Lila instead of Zara, as though Zara herself were no longer worth his attention. Your job? Lila repeated, raising an eyebrow. She held up the folder she had brought. This folder contains not only Ms. Reynolds' proof of ownership, but also her flight itinerary and correspondence with this airfield. If you'd taken the time to review what she provided earlier, we wouldn't be standing here. The young woman, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with her arms crossed. We're just following protocol, she said, her voice tight. You can't expect us to assume. Assume what? Zara interrupted, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at the woman. That I could own a jet like this? That I belong here? The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The woman opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, her face reddening. Ms. Reynolds, please, the man interjected, his tone now attempting to sound conciliatory. There's no need to escalate this. We just need to ensure. Ensure what? Zara cut him off, her voice still controlled but with a steely undertone that demanded respect. That I meet your personal standards for who should or shouldn't own a private jet. Or is it that you've decided I'm guilty of something and now need to justify your assumptions? Lila stepped closer to Zara, her presence a silent show of support. If there's an issue, perhaps you should escalate this to someone who's actually in charge, Lila suggested pointedly, her gaze shifting to the man in the suit who had appeared earlier. He was now returning, flanked by another senior airfield employee. The senior employee, a woman with a brisk yet professional demeanor, stepped between the two groups. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the tense body language, the papers in Lila's hands, and the unmistakable frustration on Zara's face. "I'm Ms. Perkins, head of operations at Eastbridge Airfield," she said, her tone crisp. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding this jet?" "Yes," Lila said before anyone else could speak. "Ms. Reynolds, the owner of this jet, has been delayed due to unwarranted questioning by the cabin crew. We've provided all necessary documentation to verify her ownership, but it appears that wasn't sufficient." Perkins turned to the cabin crew, her expression hardening. "Is this true?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "We were just trying to confirm everything. It's protocol." "It's not protocol to make baseless assumptions about our clients," Perkins interrupted sharply. She turned to Zara, her expression softening slightly. "Ms. Reynolds, on behalf of Eastbridge Airfield, I deeply apologize for this inconvenience. I assure you, this is not how we treat our clients." Before Zara could respond, the younger cabin crew member spoke up, her voice defensive. "We didn't mean any harm. It's just that, well, we've never seen her before, and she doesn't look." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late that she had said far too much. Perkins' eyes narrowed, and Lila let out a quiet gasp of disbelief. Zara tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Go on," she said softly. "I don't look like what?" The woman froze, clearly panicking. She stammered, "I didn't mean, I wasn't implying anything." "Then what were you doing?" Zara pressed gently, her voice calm, but her words cutting through the woman's excuses like a knife. The silence that followed was deafening. The male cabin crew member shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact, while the woman looked down at her shoes, her face flushed with shame. Perkins cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "Ms. Reynolds, I assure you this will be addressed immediately. In the meantime, I'll personally ensure that you and your assistant board your jet without further delay." "Thank you," Zara said, her tone polite but distant. She turned to Lila. "Let's go. We've wasted enough time." As Zara and Lila began ascending the steps to the jet, the murmurs of the other airfield staff filled the air. It was clear that the incident had not gone unnoticed. Zara could feel the weight of their stares, a mix of curiosity, guilt, and admiration. Once inside the jet, Zara sank into one of the plush leather seats, her composure finally giving way to a wave of exhaustion. Lila sat across from her, her face a mixture of anger and concern. "Are you okay?" Lila asked softly. Zara nodded, though her expression was far from relaxed. "I'm fine. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it'll be the last." Lila frowned. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Zara agreed, her gaze distant. "But it does make me stronger." Outside, the cabin crew stood in silence as Perkins reprimanded them, her voice low but stern. They knew their actions had crossed a line, and now they would have to face the consequences. Back inside the jet, Zara straightened her shoulders and adjusted her posture. She wasn't just a woman who owned a jet, she was a symbol of resilience, a quiet force challenging a world that often refused to see her worth. As the engines roared to life and the jet prepared for takeoff, Zara closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace. The confrontation might have ended, but the message it carried would echo far beyond the airfield. A witness to injustice. The luxurious airfield, with its rows of private jets and affluent clientele, seemed to operate in its own bubble, a world of privilege where wealth and power dictated the rules. Zara's encounter, however, had pierced that bubble. Word of the confrontation had begun to ripple through the small crowd of staff, onlookers, and passengers scattered around the terminal. Among them was an unlikely witness, Marcus, a quiet, middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes. Marcus wasn't part of the elite clientele. He worked as a technician, ensuring the jets were safe and in pristine condition. He had been on a break near the hangar when he noticed the scene unfolding. Something about the body language of the cabin crew, rigid, dismissive, and tense, drew his attention. As he watched from a distance, Marcus felt a familiar unease settling in his chest. Years ago, Marcus had seen similar situations play out in his own life. He had grown up in a small town where being judged by the color of his skin was an everyday occurrence. Now, watching Zara face the same dismissive attitudes he had fought to overcome, he felt a stirring of anger and a pang of guilt. He was just an observer, standing on the sidelines while someone else bore the weight of prejudice. Marcus debated whether to intervene. His position at the airfield wasn't secure, he was a contracted worker, not an employee, and speaking out could put his livelihood at risk. But the look on Zara's face as she stood her ground, dignified yet clearly frustrated, struck a chord deep within him. He took a step forward but hesitated. What could he do? What could he say that wouldn't make things worse? Just then, Zara's assistant arrived, armed with documents and a no-nonsense attitude that seemed to shift the dynamics of the situation. Marcus watched as the assistant confronted the crew, her words sharp and deliberate, cutting through their weak justifications. Still, the tension lingered. Marcus could feel it in the way the crew avoided eye contact, their discomfort evident even from a distance. He decided he couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the group, his toolbox in hand, using it as an excuse to approach. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice steady but respectful. The group turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from confusion to mild annoyance. "I couldn't help but overhear," Marcus continued, addressing the cabin crew. He kept his tone measured, his eyes flicking to Zara briefly. "I just wanted to say, I've seen Ms. Reynolds here before. She's a regular at this airfield. Always respectful, always professional." The male crew member narrowed his eyes, his posture stiffening. "And who are you exactly?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Just a technician," Marcus replied with a small shrug. "But I've been working here long enough to know our clients. Ms. Reynolds doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." Zara glanced at Marcus, her expression softening slightly. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you for his support. The younger crew member, clearly flustered, muttered something under her breath, but Marcus caught it. "He's probably just saying that because she's..." The words hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with implication. "Because she's what?" Marcus asked, his voice firm now. He stepped closer, his kind eyes now sharp with resolve. "Go ahead, finish your sentence." The woman looked down, her face flushing with embarrassment. The male crew member shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as though looking for an escape. "That's what I thought," Marcus said quietly. He turned to Zara, his voice softening. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this, ma'am. You deserve better." Zara offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said simply. Just then, the airfield's head of operations, Ms. Perkins, returned to the scene, her expression stern. She had clearly heard enough to piece together what had happened. "Mr. Marcus," she said, addressing him directly, "thank you for stepping forward. Your input is noted and appreciated." She turned her sharp gaze to the cabin crew. "As for you two, I've already spoken to management. Your actions today are completely unacceptable and do not align with our values." The male crew member opened his mouth to protest, but Perkins raised a hand to silence him. "Save it. This isn't up for discussion. Collect your belongings and leave the premises immediately." The weight of her words was undeniable. The young woman looked on the verge of tears, while the man's face twisted into a mixture of anger and humiliation. Neither dared argue further. As the crew walked away, heads lowered, Marcus let out a quiet sigh of relief. He turned back to Zara, unsure of what to say. But she spoke first. "Thank you," Zara said, her voice warm but steady. "It takes courage to speak up, especially when you don't have to." Marcus scratched the back of his neck, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just did what felt right," he said. "Too many times, I've stayed quiet when I should have said something. I wasn't about to let that happen again." Zara's smile widened slightly. "Well, it made a difference. And for that, I'm grateful." As the situation finally began to settle, Zara boarded her jet, accompanied by her assistant and the silent gratitude of Marcus. Watching the jet's engines roar to life, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He might not have changed the world, but in that moment, he had done his part to stand against injustice. Inside the jet, Zara looked out of the window as the airfield grew smaller in the distance. She thought about Marcus, a stranger who had stepped forward when others hadn't. His actions reminded her of the quiet strength that existed in unexpected places, a strength that, when harnessed, could push back against the barriers society tried to erect. For Zara, this was more than just a confrontation. It was a reminder of why she fought so hard to be where she was. And as the jet ascended into the clouds, she carried with her not just the weight of the moment but also the hope that moments like these would inspire others to speak out when it mattered most. Zara's royal identity revealed. The hum of the jet's engines filled the cabin as Zara leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed out the window. The clouds beneath them painted a serene picture, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The confrontation at the airfield lingered in her mind, not because it was new or surprising, she had faced prejudice and microaggressions before, but because it was a stark reminder of how much work remained to be done in changing perceptions. Her assistant, Lila, sat across from her, scrolling through her tablet. She occasionally glanced up at Zara, her expression a mix of frustration and admiration. Lila knew Zara to be a woman of immense patience and dignity, but even she could see the toll this morning's events had taken. Lila had always admired Zara's ability to stay composed under pressure, but today, she wished her boss didn't have to bear these burdens alone. Ms. Reynolds, Lila began tentatively, I think we should address this publicly. What happened back there wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was blatant prejudice. People need to know. Zara turned her attention to Lila, her expression thoughtful. People already know, she said softly. This isn't a new story. It happens every day to people who don't have the resources or the platform I do. She paused, then added, but you're right. Maybe it's time to remind them that these stories still exist. Lila nodded, encouraged by Zara's words. I'll draft a statement. We can use this as an opportunity to highlight the work you've been doing with the foundation. Zara's foundation, aptly named Bridges of Change, focused on promoting education, equality, and empowerment for marginalized communities. It was one of the many initiatives she spearheaded as part of her royal duties, a title she rarely flaunted but carried with pride. Back at the airfield. The airfield was still abuzz with murmurs about the morning's confrontation. The cabin crew had been escorted out, their expressions a mix of humiliation and anger. Meanwhile, Marcus, the technician who had spoken up for Zara, found himself fielding quiet words of support from his colleagues. She's someone important, isn't she? One of them asked, leaning in conspiratorially. Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He didn't know all the details about Zara's life, but he had seen enough during her visits to the airfield to know she wasn't just wealthy, she was significant. Important doesn't even begin to cover it, he finally said. But what matters more is how she carries herself. That's real royalty. The revelation. A few hours later, as Zara's jet began its descent into Geneva, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her publicist, who had caught wind of the airfield incident. The message was brief but pointed. The media has picked up on what happened. Calls are coming in for a statement. Should we release one? Zara sighed, handing the phone to Lila. Handle it, she said. But make sure the focus is on the bigger picture, not just me. This isn't about one moment, it's about a system. As the jet landed and taxied to a private hangar, Zara prepared herself for the day ahead. She was in Geneva for a humanitarian summit, a high-profile event attended by diplomats, activists, and leaders from around the world. She had been invited not only as a philanthropist, but as a representative of her country, a small but prosperous nation in West Africa where she was a beloved figure. What few people outside her inner circle knew, however, was that Zara wasn't just a representative, she was royalty. A princess by birth, Zara had chosen to downplay her title in international spaces, believing her work should speak louder than her lineage. but today, that choice would be challenged. As she stepped out of the jet, she was greeted by a small delegation of officials, their smiles warm and welcoming. Cameras clicked and reporters jostled for position, their questions ringing out in a cacophony of curiosity. "Ms. Reynolds, can you comment on the incident at Eastbridge Airfield? Is it true the cabin crew was fired on the spot? Do you think racism played a role?" Zara raised a hand, signaling for silence. Her calm demeanor instantly commanded attention. "I appreciate your interest," she began, her voice steady and measured, "but today is not about me. It's about the work we're doing here in Geneva to address issues far greater than the events of this morning." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "That said, I will say this, no one should have to justify their presence in any space simply because of how they look. That's a lesson I hope we can all take to heart." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement, but the reporters weren't done. One of them, a young journalist with a determined look, stepped forward. "Ms. Reynolds, is it true that you're a princess?" The question hung in the air, freezing the scene for a moment. Zara's lips curved into a small smile as she met the journalist's gaze. "I've never believed that titles define a person," she said. "But if it helps you understand why I fight so hard for equality and justice, then yes, I am." The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Zara's royal heritage had always been a closely guarded aspect of her life, but now, it was out in the open. And while she had spent years avoiding the spotlight that came with her title, she realized in that moment that it could be a powerful tool for change. A shift in the narrative. The news spread quickly, with headlines highlighting Zara's royal status and her dignified response to the airfield incident. Social media buzzed with support, many praising her poise and resilience in the face of discrimination. At the airfield, Marcus watched the coverage on his phone, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had known Zara was remarkable, but learning about her royal background only deepened his respect for her. "That's what I call real royalty," he muttered to himself, shaking his head in admiration. Zara's perspective. Later that evening, as Zara prepared for the summit, she reflected on the day's events. She had spent her life balancing two worlds, one of privilege and one of struggle. Her royal status had opened doors, but her identity as a Black woman had often meant those doors came with conditions and challenges. Today, however, felt different. Today, she had used her voice to challenge those conditions, to remind the world that dignity and respect should never be conditional. And as she stepped onto the stage at the summit, greeted by applause and admiration, she knew this was only the beginning. The consequences. The sun had dipped low on the horizon by the time Zara reached her hotel suite in Geneva. The events of the day lingered like a distant echo, reminders of both the challenges she faced and the strength she had cultivated to overcome them. While Zara prepared for her evening, the ripple effects of her confrontation at Eastbridge Airfield were just beginning to unfold. The airfield management takes action. Back at Eastbridge, the airfield's management team had gathered in a small, glass-walled conference room. Ms. Perkins, the head of operations, led the meeting, her expression stern. The incident with Zara had reached the higher-ups, and it was clear that swift action was required, not just to address the specific behavior of the cabin crew, but also to evaluate the culture that had allowed it to happen. "I've reviewed the reports," Perkins said, her voice steady but firm. "It's unacceptable. We've worked hard to build a reputation as a world-class facility, and incidents like this undermine everything we stand for." The airfield manager, a graying man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "The media backlash alone is enough to warrant immediate action. We've received over 100 emails since the story broke, most of them complaints." Perkins nodded. "The two crew members involved have already been terminated, but we need to go further. Sensitivity training for all staff is non-negotiable. This isn't just about avoiding bad press, it's about ensuring this never happens again." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. The decision was unanimous: Eastbridge would implement a comprehensive review of its policies, emphasizing diversity and inclusion. The cabin crew reacts. For the dismissed crew members, the fallout was swift and harsh. The man, who had been so confident in his authority, now sat alone in his modest apartment, scrolling through social media. His name had been leaked online, and the vitriol in the comments was overwhelming. "How does it feel to be fired for being racist?" one comment read. "This is what happens when you underestimate greatness," said another. He tossed his phone aside, a bitter scowl on his face. While he refused to admit fault outwardly, a small voice in the back of his mind nagged at him, a voice that reminded him how easily he had dismissed Zara, how quickly he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. The younger woman, meanwhile, was grappling with a mix of regret and defensiveness. Sitting in her parents' kitchen, she recounted the incident to her mother, trying to justify her actions. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "I was just surprised." Her mother, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze, shook her head. "Surprised by what? That a black woman could own a jet? You might not have meant harm, but that doesn't mean you didn't cause it." The words stung, but they also planted a seed. For the first time, the young woman began to truly reflect on her actions and the biases she hadn't realized she carried. Marcus becomes a voice of change. While the dismissed crew members faced their consequences, Marcus, the technician who had spoken up for Zara, found himself in an unexpected spotlight. A journalist from a prominent magazine reached out to him for an interview after learning about his role in the incident. "I'm not a hero," Marcus told the reporter, sitting in a modest cafe near the airfield. "I just did what anyone should do when they see something wrong. But I'll admit, it feels good to know that speaking up made a difference." The journalist leaned forward. "Why did you decide to intervene? You could have stayed quiet, like most people would." Marcus hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I've stayed quiet too many times in my life. Growing up, I saw my parents get overlooked, disrespected, and dismissed just because of the color of their skin. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen to someone else if I could help it." The article that followed framed Marcus as an everyday hero, a man who used his voice to stand against injustice. His story inspired countless readers, many of whom reached out to thank him for his courage. Zara's influence spreads. The media coverage of Zara's royal identity and her dignified handling of the airfield incident created a wave of admiration across social media. Videos of her addressing reporters in Geneva went viral, with hashtags like #RoyalGrace and #EqualityForAll trending worldwide. Among the many responses was an outpouring of support from other high-profile figures. Activists, celebrities, and even fellow royals praised Zara for her composure and the powerful message she had delivered. One tweet from a prominent actress read, "Zara Reynolds is proof that grace under pressure can change the world. A true queen in every sense of the word. Crown #role model." But Zara was less interested in the praise and more focused on the conversations her story had sparked. In the days that followed, she worked closely with her team to amplify the voices of others who had experienced discrimination in similar situations. She partnered with advocacy groups, launched a campaign highlighting stories of resilience, and pledged additional funding from her foundation to support initiatives promoting equality in the aviation industry. A meeting with the airfield management. A week after the incident, Zara received a request for a private meeting with Eastbridge's management. Curious but cautious, she agreed. The meeting took place in a discreet office at the airfield, away from the prying eyes of the press. Ms. Perkins greeted Zara warmly but with a clear sense of humility. "Ms. Reynolds, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We owe you an apology, not just for the actions of our staff, but for the culture that allowed it to happen." Zara listened quietly as Perkins outlined the steps the airfield was taking to address the issue: mandatory training, updated policies, and a commitment to diversifying their workforce. When Perkins finished, Zara nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good start," she said. "But real change doesn't happen overnight. It requires constant effort and accountability." Perkins met her gaze. "We understand. And we hope you'll consider partnering with us to ensure we stay on the right path." Zara smiled. "If you're serious about making a difference, then yes. I'd be happy to help." A lesson learned. As Zara left the meeting, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. The events at Eastbridge had been deeply frustrating, but they had also sparked meaningful conversations and actions. And for Zara, that was the ultimate victory. Back at the airfield, Marcus watched her car drive away, a smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know where Zara's journey would take her next, but he was certain of one thing: she wasn't just royalty by birth, she was royalty in spirit, a woman who used her power to lift others and inspire change.